So there are different types of leases you need to be familiar with, and really this is just a memory small module here. But you do need to memorize these different types of leases because you'll likely get a question or two on them. But the first type of lease is what we call a graduated lease. With this type of lease, it just means there's a escalator clauses that has been built into the lease. When we say escalator clause, it means that there's a provision in the lease that says after a certain period of time, say for example, you have a 1-year lease and you decide to stay beyond that, you want to extend the lease. Well, there'll be a provision in that lease says that starting year 2, the rent will go up 3%, 5%, whatever amount they decide for it to go up. But it's just, an escalator clause just means there's some built-in provision that will create an increase or potentially a decrease, but typically it's an increase in rent that will automatically go into effect after a certain period of time. Okay. But so a graduated lease just means there's an escalator clause in the lease. You also have percentage leases. You tend to see these primarily in your commercial leases, where malls do this quite a bit. They like to use a percentage lease. If you wanted to open up a place of business inside of a mall, how does the mall make money? Well, the mall will get some percentage of all the gross receipts, all the sales that take place within that mall. So what they'll do, they'll set up this percentage lease where usually you will have a base rent, a certain amount of rent you have to pay every month. But typically with this type of lease, the base rent is not that much. It's fairly small comparatively speaking. But in addition to the base rent, you would also have to pay some percentage of whatever your sales were, your gross receipts were for that month. I've had people say, well, I don't think I would like that. And I'm thinking that's the way to go, especially if you're just starting a business. Because, what if you have a month that's just not very good? You don't get many sales. Well, the good news is your rent's not going to be as high, right? So, I don't have a problem with these percentage leases. I think they work pretty good. The next type is a net lease. Sometimes you hear it called double net or triple net. But again, these are more common, more typical in your commercial type leases, where basically, again, with a net lease, and I will tell you, if you're ever signing doing a commercial lease for your business or whatever, you better pay attention to this, because I find a lot of leasing agents tend to not discuss this too much. They'll tell you how much the rent is each month, but they don't really get into these net costs that are associated with a net lease. Because basically what they're doing with the net lease, the tenants will also, in addition to whatever the monthly rent is, will have to pay some pro rata share of what the operational and maintenance expenses are for that facility. Again, that's all paid in addition on top of whatever the monthly rent would be. So what are we talking about? Operational and maintenance costs. It could be taxes, insurance. If they have security there, y'all got to pay for that. Maintenance. You name it. Pretty much any expenses associated with that facility, all the tenants will have to pay some pro rata share of all these expenses. This is over and above whatever your monthly rent would be. And I'm telling you, some of these net costs could be very expensive. So I wouldn't just decide I'm going to rent this space here, commercial space with a net lease, especially a triple net lease, and I don't know what these costs are going to be. You better be asking that question, because I'm telling you, a lot of times they tend not to discuss that with you. They might say that you might have to pay some prorated share of these expenses. Well, I want to know, well, how much are they? Because I'm telling you, they can be a shock to you. Well, it was to me when I first did it, I can assure you. So be careful with the net lease. You could go with a gross lease. Now, this is the type of lease you see in your typical residential leases. With a residential or a gross lease, the tenant's just going to pay whatever the rent is, and then the landlord is responsible for any operational and maintenance costs. So at least here with a gross lease, tenant knows, I just pay my rent and that's it. The landlord's got to pay for any other cost associated with this property. That's the gross lease. You could have an index lease, which again more common with commercial leases. But this is a lease where the rent is tied directly to some economic index. More than likely going to be like the consumer price index, the CPI. But as that index goes up, so does your rent. Your rent's going to go up. But on the flip side, if it comes down, then your rent will obviously come down as well. So the nice part about an index lease is, it's pretty much tied directly to how the economy is doing at that time. But anyway, what does an index lease do, or what's it tied to? Some economic index, usually the consumer price index, whatever that CPI would be. Okay. And then, the last type of lease we're going to talk about here is something called a ground lease. The ground lease, well, first of all, is pretty much what it sounds like. You're just leasing dirt, the ground. But these are typically long-term leases, okay? Typically at least 10 years. I think probably the more common numbers is closer to 50 years. But but they're normally at least 10 years. These are long leases. And again, typically used for commercial purposes. But they may, the tenant, they'll lease the ground and maybe even build a building, a structure on, to run their business out of or whatever. So they build the building, but the building they've spent their money on is on land they do not own. They've leased the land. It might be a long-term lease. It might be, like I said, 50 years. But the other good news, at least for the landowner, the taxes on that land, again, are typically paid by the tenant. So there's really not much, there's not a whole lot of cost associated with owning the land in something like this. They're just making money on the lease. But what happens at the end of that 10 years or 50 years, however long it is, and there's a building now on the property. Who now owns that building? The landowner. They now own, they still own the land, but they also own any buildings you put on that property too. So, there's a lot of positives for the landowner to do a ground lease for sure, even though it does tie up that land for pretty long period of time for sure. So those are your different types of leases.